But thank you for the introduction. And yeah, I've been growing orchids for a long, long time and have a lot of helpful hints for everyone about how you can grow them in your conditions that you have and what orchids you can grow in your condition. Are what are called epiphytic orchids. Okay, epiphytic means they grow clinging to trees. These are usually tropical orchids that we grow. But I want you to know the state flower of Minnesota is a lady slipper orchid. The state wildflower of New Hampshire is a lady slipper orchid. There are 30,000 orchids naturally in nature all over the world, mainly in the tropical and subtropical areas. But in North America, we have 274 orchids. In Dallas County, we have 3, and in Fort Worth County, Tarrant County, we have 4 native orchids that grow like wildflowers. They're very difficult to transplant and put in a pot. So that's why you don't see those. Very small flowers. They're sapophytic, which means you don't ever see the foliage. You just see the flower. When it comes up, everything else is underground. So these are tropical orchids I have on display here. And that's mainly what we're going to talk about today. So, when we talk about the possibilities, what possibilities with 30,000 orchids that occur naturally, but millions. I don't know what's happening to my throat now. Millions of hybrids. And so my husband's hybridized orchids. I don't know how many have been up to South Lake and see Peter Lynn. He's made many hybrids all over the world. People are making hybrids orchids, just like all the other plants. In fact, it's very, very difficult sometimes now thank you very much, to find plants that are not hybrids or selected clones of a specific plant. A selected clone, like how many of you grow lantana? How many of you grow lantana? How many of you have berries on your lantana? How many do not have berries on your lantana? And that's because they have selected that clone because it doesn't make berries. And that keeps flowering and flowering all summer long. In fact, mine's still flowering. And so we have to look at that possibility of what we want to grow. This is the big International Orchid Show that we had in Miami a few years ago. And yes, the zoo brought out live flamingos. For the entrance. I couldn't believe it either. When I started walking in, I was like, Mary, they're moving. And this is the type of thing that these orchid shows have. So if you ever have an opportunity to go to an orchid show, please do. Fort Worth Botanic Gardens had one of the largest orchid shows ever put on in the state of Texas. Not this past spring, not this spring, and they'll do it again in 2025. So please look forward to that. We had thousands and thousands of orchids on display. How many of you got to go to that and see it? It was really, really something. It was so much fun planning it and putting it together. And so these orchid shows are very elaborate. These are actually styrofoam built to look like, karst mountains, and orchids are put in amongst them. But this is what we're interested in, how to grow these. And so when we look at this, 30,000 species, that's something that occurs naturally in nature, species, and we have 600 genera, millions of hybrids. So botanically, what we're talking about, all plants are, the nomenclature is done by the flower. And so we need to look at the flower to look at this. They're herbaceous perennials. They never make wood. They're all evergreen herbaceous perennial, and of course a North American, European, and China, Japan. We have herbaceous perennials that freeze down and come back from the roots or the tubers or rhizomes. They're monocots. Does everybody know monocot, that term? Okay, monocot means they have parallel veins. They have a one-seed leaf. You all probably grow all kinds of monocot. Number one, grass is a monocot. In fact, it's the most grown plant in the world. But don't think of your lawn as that grass. Think of what you just ate as the grass that is most grown in the world. Wheat, rice, they're the number 1 and 2. Barley, oats, those are all corn, those are all grasses. They have an inferior ovary, which means part of the flower stem that we think about right here is part of this is the inferior ovary. And so you can come up and look at this closer, you know, between the, I made a mess. Okay. Okay, so we'll go on and look at what is defined, the flower. All monocots have three sepals, 3 petals. In most cases, the sepals subtend the petals to make a green structure, but in the form of orchids and other plants too. Oh, thank you so much. There wasn't much here, but in my cup, thank goodness. Thank you. Thank you. And so 3 sepals. The sepals are the first set of floral leaves, and then the petals are here, mirror images of each other. And then we have this, what is called the lip or the labellum. The lip or the labellum is the part of the flower structure that attracts the insects, either by a promise of nectar or a promise of pollen. In the case of Phalaenopsis, which is the most produced and grown and flowered orchid in the world, not just the United States, in the world, for sale. Then we have what is called the column here in the throat. And the column in the throat holds both the female and male parts of the flower. And so this is what we're very interested in. As far as North America, I think I've already told you that we have 54 orchids in Texas, native to Texas, but unfortunately, some of these, like Spirantha pipax, has not been found for up to 5 years. Once it has not been found for 10 years, then it's the botanists start discussing calling it extinct. Right now, it's on the endangered list. But this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is some acreage that some developer bought, and he did it 1 acre, 2 acres, 3 acre parcels. And these people, the first thing they wanted to do was get rid of all the coastal Bermuda grass that the cattle ate in this area. And so when they were doing that, they wanted to put a perennial border along their driveway. And so they tilled the soil to try to get rid of the coastal Bermuda grass. And guess what came up? This is a Spiranthes orchid. Now this is not, we have 2 genera of Spiranthes here in the Tarrant County area. This is not the one that grows here. This is wisteria. And so we want to look at Sinua that grows here and Nivea that grows here. But you see how it spirals around the stem. And so I got a call from these people that, they hope they have an orchid. And what can they do to preserve it? Well, orchids, underground parts of the saprophytic orchids have, like little tuber type things, and they grow in clumps because of that. And our orchids in the tropics do that same thing. The growth habits, as far as that's concerned, we have sympodal orchids, which means many stems. And so we could look at an orchid like this epidendrum here, and we can see that there are many, many, many stems coming up. We have it getting ready to bloom here, it's getting ready to bloom here, it is blooming here, many, many, many stems. This is called sympodal orchid. And they usually have what are called pseudobulbs, or they have canes like this. How many of you have ever bought a dendrobium and you have that big thick cane that comes up? That's the same thing, or rhizomes. And then when we look at the growth habit, what we want to do is look for new growth. And so orchids are like all the other plants in your landscape, in your house, in your greenhouse. They only bloom on new growth. So we have to let them grow. You know, the most asked question around springtime is, why are my hydrangeas not blooming? That comes into the extension office. Why are the hydrangeas not blooming? Everyone else's is blooming. Hydrangea is a deciduous plant, and so a lot of times people think, oh, well, those are dead stems, and cut them off. Well, if they cut them off, they just cut off their flowers. They set their flowers in the fall. Magnolia trees do this. A lot of plants do this. Wisteria, why isn't wisteria ever bloom? Because you chop it back and you cut off the new growth. And orchids are that same way. So this is a rhizomatous orchid, a sympodal orchid, and you can see here's your pseudobulbs, and on top of your pseudobulbs you have this beautiful, beautiful green leaf. The new growth comes from the base of the old growth. Now there's two reasons I want you to know this. Number one, I want you to watch for it so you can give that new growth the best light that you can give it. Cattleyas need a lot of light. In fact, they grow better outside during the summer than even in a greenhouse. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. But definitely, these are the most fragrant orchids in the world. They grow all over South America and Latin America. Very, very, very fragrant. Very wonderful to have. Used to be in the 20s and 30s, into the 40s, the most sought after corsage orchids. We had greenhouses all over the West Coast and the East Coast that did nothing but grow Cattleya orchids for the corsage orchid that every mother wanted on Mother's Day, every date wanted when she went out with the GIs coming back from the war. I mean, it was really amazing, the history of these desirable plants. We have monopodal orchids meaning one stem, and so you can see the one stem, and between the leaves on that one stem, we have the inflorescence, the flowers coming out. And this is why I'm trying to explain to you how important the new growth is. We have to have the new growth in order for them to flower. And so just like the landscape plants you have. And so for every year, this is a vanda, for every year they put on two new leaves. Two new leaves, two new leaves, two new leaves. Some vandas grow so fast, you'll get pairs of new leaves. The Phalaenopsis, which are the most popular plant sold in the world, puts on two new leaves a year. That's it. That's all you get. And so you have got to watch this and make sure that the light you have it in is putting on those two new leaves. If by July you don't see the second leaf coming on, you need to put it in a little bit more light to get that second leaf on there. They go like this. In nature, they grow like this. This is how they grow in nature, clinging to the trunk or the branch of a tree. All I've done is tied that to this piece of cork. It's been growing on here for years. And you can see I use monofilament wire and moss, and then I renew the moss. You can see that now what it's doing is it's putting out little kikis, what we call baby plants, kiki in Hawaiian, and that's how it propagates itself in nature, by growing the little kikis, by continuing the rhizome if it's a sympodal orchid, and they also can get pollinated and produce seed. The seed is a naked embryo. There's no seed coat on it, so all seed is planted in a laboratory on a nutrient agar. Anyone who's taken the propagation class? How many of you have taken the Master Gardener propagation class? Yeah. Well, you know I brought that to the propagation class several times to show everyone how that does. But that's how they reproduce in nature. They have to find the right mycorrhizae fungus to land on. They create a symbiotic relationship. So the seed pod produces millions of seeds. Hopefully, one or two will germinate in nature. But in a laboratory, we can germinate every single one of them. Okay, so This is a picture of a friend of mine's in Florida, and this is South Florida, Homestead, and it's an epiphytic orchid clinging to a tree. He's had that on there about 10 years, and it's just like I've had this on this piece of cork for about 10 years. You know, probably these little kiki plants off of here, I've given them away lots of different times. And so lithophytic means they grow on rocks. How many of you ever been to South America, maybe Peru? Machu Picchu. This isn't Machu Picchu. This is crevices in the rocks. You can see where the water comes, and you got all this moss growing, and you have these wonderful, wonderful ceratopodiums blooming. Absolutely beautiful. Very, very, very fragrant. The insects and the birds are attracted to them to pollinate them. Terrestrial means they grow in the ground. And so we have all kinds of terrestrial orchids we can grow here. They grow in nature. In fact, one of the first times I ever saw an orchid was with my Girl Scout troop. We were canoeing up the B&O Canal in the eastern part of the United States, and we got out to portage our thing around the Great Falls, got under a shade tree because it was hot. And there were these interesting plants growing on the ground. I had no idea what they were. And I thought, well, someday I'll look it up and find out. About 10 years later, I found out it was a native orchid, native to the United States, a herbaceous perennial orchid, growing like a ground cover. And so there are those that we can grow like begonias. Wonderful, wonderful plants. This is sapophytic. This is a close-up of the spiranthes. And you can see how the bee gets in there. The hood over the entrance makes it look for that yellow, and that yellow, of course, is what attracts it, thinking it's going to get violent. We also have vining orchids. The most grown commercial orchid in the world, besides Phalaenopsis, is vanilla. So this is a vanilla plant. Vanilla grows in plantations all over the world. It was first discovered in Mexico. That's why you probably in the past have heard of Mexican vanilla from Mexico, because most of the vanilla was grown in Mexico at one time. Unfortunately, those plantations went by the way, and they turned into coffee plantations, and then they turned into stuff we don't want people to grow, plantations, you know. And so the McCormick and all the vanilla extra people started making funding plantations other places. Madagascar has 3 large plantations. The Bourbon Islands between India and Africa, they have wonderful plantations. Haiti has a wonderful plantation. Hawaii has a wonderful plantation. So they're all over the world in the tropics. The only vanilla plantation left in Mexico is in Veracruz. And so I don't think, many people are traveling in Mexico now, but you might have an opportunity to be somewhere else that grows vanilla and see how it's grown. It's grown on wire like we grow grape wines. Everyone here has probably seen the vineyard over here by the airport, or another vineyard, or a demonstration here in town about how grapes are grown on a wire. Because why? They have to chop them back very vigorously because they only bloom and fruit on new growth. Does everybody understand that? Same with the vanilla. And so once they've harvested all the beans from one crop, then they chop it back so it'll produce a lot of new growth, just like we do grapevines, so they can have more vanilla. The flower is pollinated, and the seed pod is your vanilla bean. The vanilla bean is harvested green. It's laid out in the sunlight, and it turns very oily looking and very aromatic. And then it is sold to the extractors, and then most of it's extracted here in the United States, believe it or not, and then shipped out to all the places that buy it. This orchid, this is a Cattleya orchid, beautiful, fragrant, just wonderful. This orchid, when some of the naturalists, every time an expedition went out in the world, they were sent out to look for commerce and to claim the land for their country, whether it was Portugal or Spain or England or Holland. You know, so that's what they were sent out for. But most of them sent a naturalist too with them. And when this guy found this plant in bloom, you know, on the east coast of South America, Brazil, and he thought, oh my goodness, this is something we've got to get back, you know, and they did. You know, the ships, when they went out like that, were going for years and years, you know, because this. But this, because of the big giant pseudobulb it has, it lasted for years and years and made it back to England. This happened to be a British ship. And Fred Sanders was the horticulturist that worked at one of the palaces there. He was so excited to get a new plant that had this flower that the naturalist described. And he said, well, where was it growing? It was growing way up in a tree. Someone had to climb up there and chop it out of there. And so he thought it grew in the shade. It doesn't grow in the shade. It wants lots and lots of sun. But anyway, he tried growing it for several years and decided this isn't going to ever bloom. But when it bloomed, it caused, in history of horticulture, orchid delirium, that part of the world. And so people demanded the plants, they demanded clothes and jewelry made to look like this orchid. I mean, in the history of horticulture, you all know about the history of tulip mania. Well, they didn't want to call it orchid mania, so they called it orchid delirium. And it caused the same effect. The same effect. People would rig up a boat, a ship, you know, to go to somewhere in the world, and they were told, now look for gold and silver and jade and turquoise, but look for orchids too. The only reason we have vanilla, or we found out about vanilla, is when Cortez went to Mexico, Montezuma welcomed him with a drink. And this drink had chocolate and vanilla in it. Now, this was the 1500s, right? 1500s. They didn't have chocolate or vanilla till the 1500s? Oh my gosh, how did they survive? But he took the vanilla vine back to England with him, or Spain, but they didn't know how to get the vanilla out of it. They didn't understand you had to let flower, you had to pollinate the flower, or because the bee that pollinates it naturally wasn't in Spain. But anyway, it's a great, great, great history. The history of discovery of plants. Cotton. Who knows where cotton was discovered? Right here in the United States. They wore wool and linen in Europe. They wore silk in Asia. Can you imagine having to wear wool and linen year-round? Plant discovery is amazing. So we want to talk about the easy-to-grow orchids here in Fort Worth, Texas. Because when you think about that 30,000 orchid genera, 600 genera, man, what are we going to grow? There's a reason this is the most popular plant. Number one reason is this has been in bloom for 2 months. It's probably going to be in bloom for 2 more months. This has been in bloom for 5 months. This has been in bloom. Let's see, that started one flower lost. This has probably been in bloom for 3 months. If I can grow and bloom an orchid in my son's high school cowboy boots, y'all can grow orchids in a pot. Okay? This is in bloom 9 months out of the year. It's a little species. So Phalaenopsis are most popular because the length of time they're in bloom. The second one is Paphiopedilum. I only had one in bloom, and it looked like it was going to fall off if I touched it because it had been in bloom for so long. Lady slipper orchids. And then the Cattleyas are so popular. A cattleya, because of its pseudobulb in storing all that water and carbohydrates in the pseudobulb, believe it or not, it's one of the orchids that you could grow, throw it somewhere, forget about it. If you have it outside growing for the summer, bring it in for the winter, and it's going to bloom for you. It thrives on neglect. It likes to go wet and dry, wet and dry, wet and dry. Dendrobiums, they grow with a big long cane, most of them. Some of them grow pendulum with their canes, and they flower in the spring and the fall. And then we have vandas. A lot of times when you go to Hawaii and you get an orchid lei, it's made out of vanda flowers. If you didn't order an orchid lei, it's made out of frangipani or plumeria. You know, very, very, very fragrant flower. But they grow vandas by the acres in Thailand for the cut flowers as well as selling the plants. The Thailand government subsidize orchid growing because they don't want them growing poppies. And so they, Holland subsidized the orchid industry, the tulip industry. A lot of times governments subsidize their horticulture crops, like we do. Oncidiums are from, again, South America, Mid-America, Latin America. And these are plants that are softer tissue, and they grow like grass, and sometimes you look at them and say, what's that grassy plant over there? It's not a grass, it's an orchid. And they bloom with beautiful, beautiful long inflorescence that last about a month and a half, and so they're very popular too for that reason. Jewel orchids, I actually thought I put one in my box, but I meant to bring it to you. The jewel orchid is what I found in Virginia when we were canoeing on the B&O Canal, but I didn't know that for about 15 years later that it was a jewel orchid. They're terrestrial orchids that grow like a ground cover. They bloom in the spring, and I have a 3,000 square foot greenhouses, and all my jewel orchids are right here on the bench by when you come in the door, and you come in the door anytime from April, May, June, and those are all in bloom. And the first thing you ask is, wow, what is that great smell? The foliage is beautiful. The foliage is beautiful. So it's a nice looking plant all the time. And this is your lady slipper orchid. This is a hybrid, not a hybrid, this is a species from Asia. So they're called Paphiopedilum if they're from Asia. In South America, they call them Phragmipediums. And here in the United States, we call them Cypripediums. And there's one in Mexico, it's really, really hard to grow, called Mexipedium, because it's a xeric orchid. But we like those. The cattleyas are these big, beautiful, bold, fragrant. The plants are big and bold. The tissue, the leaf is like cardboard. Wonderful, wonderful plant to have. This is a selection of dendrobiums that I grow at the Fort Worth Botanic Gardens for their conservation collection. This is vandas on display at that big international orchid show in Miami. And these are oncidiums. Look at this. Is this not wonderful? They're like buttercups, but more. And so the foliage is nice and soft and doesn't need as much light as the cattleyas or the vandas, so they're easy to grow on a windowsill. Very, very easy to grow. And then this is a jewel orchid. See, the foliage is pretty, not just the beautiful fragrant flowers, I should say. And this is a selection of Phalaenopsis in my greenhouse. And I wanted to show this picture particularly because of the variety that you're seeing. When you go to the grocery store, they usually just carry the big white ones because they're the most popular. But I want you to know that sometimes you take one like this and you put it on a white orchid, grow the seeds up, and you get something like this. Bigger flowers, more color, all kinds of wonderful, wonderful things happen. And so you can see some of them are yellow with spots, pink center, white edging, all these different flowers. These are all different flowers that my husband has hybridized. There's another part of the bench with these big, beautiful, he takes these little flowers and puts them on a big white flower like this, and he gets these beautiful reddish purple phalaenopsis. There's another selection. So here, what do we require? Low light. Low light. That's why this is also the most kept. Unfortunately, orchids and poinsettias are competing for the title of most thrown away orchid. Or most thrown away plant, I should say. Most thrown away plant. Poinsettia is still number one, but orchids are number two. Because people think when the flowers fall off, that's it, that's all you get, let's get rid of it. But it's not. It's a herbaceous perennial. This plant is probably 10 or 15 years old. Okay, this plant right here, we could almost count the leaves, the pairs of leaves, and see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 6 above, but a lot of times the lower leaves fall off, and so you're not counting those. So I have orchids that I've had for 30, 35 years, growing in my, too big to bring here, I'm sorry. Too heavy to bring here too. But we have to look at that, low light. Like a begonia? How many of you grow begonias? How many of you have African violets? How many of you have Paphos ivy? You know, that's the light conditions these need. And so that's why they're so popular. And so when we look at these and we want to put our new leaves on after they finish blooming, we could cut the flower stem off and then wait till March, April, and they'll bloom again. But you have to have them put on those 2 notes. If this was my window right here, I would be setting this plant down like this. So all the leaf could have that good window light. I wouldn't turn it around like this and have the backside to it. You want the most leaf surface facing the greatest source of light. And that's true with any plant. No, you're going to cut the old stem off in order to encourage more growth to get another inflorescence. And usually you can tell that by about July, it will have put its 2 new leaves on, or 1 whole new leaf and half of the second leaf. But that's how you do. A south wind is best, but it might be too hot, so you have to bring it back from the window. Or an east wind is good, west wind is not so good. A north wind, it doesn't ever get direct sunlight, so it's okay, but it's not great. Flowers last 2 to 3 months or more. So look at the long inflorescence on this thing. Look at all the nodes where flowers have fallen off. How long do you think this thing has been in bloom? Forever. And so I think one of the branches, one of the stems broke. Okay, the next we have the lady slipper orchids, a Cypripedium. This is one that grows here in East Texas. I should say northeast Texas, where the acidic soil is. This is Cypripedium pavifolia. This is a Paphiopedilum from Asia called Delanatii. This is a Phragmipedium from South America. This was only discovered in nature in 1921. 1921. Recently. That's why I want you to know. This was found recently. No telling what you're going to find when you go walking in the woods. These are Paphiopedilums from Asia. This is arrangement of cut flowers of Paphiopedilum. So there's all different kinds. Many different colors. These are what we call the bulldog paths. The flowers are about as big as your hand, and they only put 1 flower per stem. I like the ones that are called multiflora. You can see how many stems, how many flowers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. stems on this. They're called multifloras. They lead low to medium light. Some have variegated foliage, and some have just green foliage. So they actually make pretty plants. A lot of times orchids don't make real pretty plants, but the paphs do. The flowers last 1 to 3 months, and again, that depends on, if they're multiflora or successive flowers, where they put up a stem and then that flower fades, the stem grows, and they put another flower. That's called successive growing. Again, low light. You can grow these in your house on a south or east window. And these are the Bessii that were discovered in South America. This is the most recently discovered orchid. This is called Grapevine, named after one of the persons who funded the expedition. And unfortunately, by then, Brazil and Peru and Ecuador, they decided their orchids were national treasures. National treasures. You have to add a permit to go look for them. If you want to get one, it has to be grown in one of their nurseries there in their country. And they have special tags they put on the plants, say nursery grown. Well, unfortunately, one of the people on the expedition that discovered this orchid decided to put one in a suitcase. That's the only time I know of that someone has gone to jail and been fined millions of dollars because he took that out of the country. Went to jail. Had to pay $1 million fine. Cattleya. Oh, I must have had 2 boxes packed because I packed up a Cattleya. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Cattleya. So there are many varieties. These need highlight. Like I said, their foliage is almost like cardboard, and they can be grown outdoors for the summer and love it. And then you could bring them in for the winter. The flowers are very fragrant, but they only last 4 to 6 weeks. And you may grow them outdoors during the summer. Remember to bring them in during the winter when it starts getting down below 40 degrees. This is an Oncidium. I did have this one in bloom. And the reason I wanted to bring this Oncidium, not the the buttercup yellow ones, is because I told you about how when we hybridize orchids, we take the seeds in a laboratory, grow them in a nutrient agar. This is a mimicry plant. You've heard of mimicry plants. They mimic an insect for the insect to land on it, and in landing on it, it gets pollinated. There are many orchids that are that way. And in this case, this is called the butterfly orchid. It mimics the Oncidium, it is Oncidium papilio. It mimics a papilio butterfly. And so the butterfly lands on this thinking it's another butterfly, and that's how it's get pollinated. So it's just a wonderful one. All the other Oncidium, not all of them, but most of the Oncidiums, we think of this. This is a plant that's probably 5 years old. Look at the show it's putting on. And it needs low to medium light. Low to medium light. It can grow on your windowsill. You can put it outside for the summer if you have some shade. Same with the Phalaenopsis. If you have shade, you could put these outside for the summer. It's just a wonderful idea how you can grow these. This is Oncidium sugar baby. It's one of the most fragrant. Here's a close-up of the flowers. And then there are other Oncidiums, many different colors. Medium light. Windowsill, perfect for windowsill. Lasts 1 to 2 months, and many are fragrant. These are the dendrobiums. These are cane dendrobiums. Very pretty, long-lasting flowers. Some of them very showy with the color. Some of them with the configuration. This is Dendrobii indolindum broomfeltzii. Broomfeltz was a German botanist that went all over the world collecting herbarium specimens, for Kew Gardens and the Heidelberg Botanic Gardens and the Frankfurt Botanic Gardens. So his name, you'll see his name a lot on different plants. Vanda, it grows taller and taller and taller and taller and taller. Sometimes it'll drop its lower leaves. Phalaenopsis sometimes drop their lower leaves. But when it blooms on all new growth. And so a lot of time what happens with the Vandas and some Phalaenopsis, and definitely the epidendrum here, they put out what we call basal kikis, whereas the Phalaenopsis can do that in its pot, but these are kikis that have grown on the old flower stem. How many of you have ever done an airplane plant? You take these off to give them to your friends. Well, these are easy to share because of that. It can grow in a pot too, but most of the time, I like to be different. Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna have to come over here until I get this back together. Thank you. And here's a close-up of the Vanda. And this pink one, I don't know, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and heavier. Finally, it fell down onto the floor in the greenhouse. And this one young lady that was there, did I do that? I felt like saying, yeah, you knocked it off. No. I said, no, it needs dividing. So we divided it up and put them all in different pots. It was so much fun doing that. But Vandas, anything from blues to purples to magenta. I have an orange one that when it's in bloom looks like a neon light. You walk in the greenhouse and go, wow, what is that over there? It's a multi-growth plant, puts on 7 to 6 inflorescence, and then I have a deep red one that does that same thing. But see, high light, just like with the Cattleya. They need lots and lots of light. So this person, you notice where it is? It's hanging from their tree out in their backyard. Not in full hot Texas sun, but they're hanging there enough that they can get enough sun to bloom. I once had a master gardener bring an orchid into the extension office in downtown Fort Worth, and he said, grows and grows and grows and never blooms. I said, it's a Cattleya. It needs lots of light. Hang it outside under one of your trees and see what happens. He brought a picture of it. It had about 7 different flowers on it. I mean, not 7 different, but I'm so sorry. And then the jewel orchids. Really, really pretty. Now, in your house, one of the things I insist on is when it's in bloom, you put it where you will enjoy it the most. Whether that's your bedroom, where you do your reading, not by the fireplace, but, somewhere. Dining table, coffee table, you put it where you're going to enjoy it the most. While it's in bloom, it's not really growing. It's not going to start growing again till the flowers are almost faded. The growing conditions are different. And most of the time, when people tell me it grows but it doesn't bloom, it's a light issue. Light is the most limiting factor. If you put it in the shade and it needs more light, it's not going to bloom. If you put it in high light outdoors on your patio, it might burn. You have to understand where it needs to go. Humidity, everyone says 50% of higher. Well, if it's in your backyard growing under a tree, you got 50% humidity in that micro environment under that tree. You might not have that in your house, but Phalaenopsis and the lady slipper orchids grow really well in the house. Some dendrobiums do too. Oh, water. low salinity. I put that because a lot of times, oh man, I was speaking in Houston and, I said low salinity and they said, I heard all this, in the audience. I guess they don't have low salinity water. And so we talked about rainwater harvesting after that big groan from the group. Florida, same thing. I was in St. Augustine. I spoke in St. Augustine and then Sarasota and then went down to Tampa and then went to Miami. Did the whole speaker circuit there. And most of them the same thing. Salinity was a big problem. Temperature, anywhere from 60 to 90 degrees is what you will always rate. But this summer, those vandas up in the top of my greenhouse on the Encilia from Africa, I bet it was 110 up there. And I burnt a few plants. Some bulbophyllums hanging up there with the vanda. Mistake. Should have taken them down. They like the sun, but they don't like the heat. And so we have to understand that part. When the night temperatures start getting 60, 55, 50 consistently, that's when, if you're growing plants sensitive to cold, you need to bring them indoors. And most of our tropical orchids that we grow are that way. And then fertilizer, you want a high nitrogen or a balanced fertilizer. Most of us grow orchids in a mixture of charcoal, perlite, and bark. This is Douglas fir bark. And we do that because the orchid roots want a lot of air. They don't want to be in potting soil where there's not much air. We have a lot of good potting soil, good for terrestrial plants, but not orchids. I mean, look at the roots these orchids put out. Look at these roots. They're covered with a spongy tissue called velamen. The true root is inside the spongy tissue. And you put them in a pot that doesn't get a lot of air in there, and they start getting what we call overwatered. Okay, not because you are watering them too much, just because the potting material doesn't have enough air in it, stays wet too long. We repot orchids out of the bark mixture when the bark is broken down into compost because it stays too wet for too long. Fertilizer, you use a water-soluble fertilizer. You can buy that anywhere. It doesn't have to say orchid fertilizer on it. But a high nitrogen fertilizer is recommended because of the bark constantly breaking down and using a lot of nitrogen in order to do that. Okay, so as far as the light goes, use the hand method. Most of us don't have a light meter, to check that light. And remember that the light changes from winter to summer, coming from. It goes 15 degrees more south in the winter and then comes up 15 degrees in the summertime. And so your light at the windows will change. Your light in your backyard will change. And so with bright light, which is, 1,500 to 3,000 foot candles, you should see a good shadow. You should be able to distinguish where your fingers are. And then filtered light, of course, the shadow is not as well. Experience speaking, light's a limiting factor, particularly for flowering. They'll grow, but they may not flower. I wish I had brought my other box with the jewel orchid and cattleya in it. But I showed that jewel orchid, brought it to a meeting like this one time, and the lady said, "That's an orchid? I've been growing that for years and years and years. I had no idea that was an orchid." And I said, "Well, haven't she flowered it and smelled it?" And no, never flowered, just grows and grows. Oh, that's so funny. So, experience speaking. Wait, there was one other thing. Oh, the flowers need to face the source of greatest light. All plants grow to the source of greatest light. And so that's what this plant is doing. That's what this plant is doing. That's what this plant is doing. They grow. Even rhizomatous orchids, I can look down at a cattleya, an oncidium, and I can see where the new growth is coming out. And I want that facing the south in my greenhouse, because that's where the greatest light is, south in a greenhouse, in the northern hemisphere. Geotropism, plants grow to the source of greatest light. And so we need to find out what we like, and then once we know, we can grow the phalaenopsis, the lady slippers, the dendrobiums, whatever we want to try, then we want to get a few more varieties of that. Not all white phalaenopsis. Get some pink ones. Get some red ones. Get some yellow ones. They have yellow ones. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So we have to think in terms of that. Watering, of course, in the house, a lot of times you take it to the sink, let it water, set it down, let it drain, and then put it back where you can enjoy it or grow it. In a greenhouse, I use a garden hose, and I use to fertilize, because this is a huge greenhouse, I use what is called a Siphonex. It hooks to your spigot and your hose. See it there? Where my spigot is, and then the fertilizer is siphoned up into the garden hose and is distributed at the proportion I want it to be distributed. Greenhouses are fun to have, but a lot of maintenance involved in them. This master gardener loves orchids so much she had a stained glass window made for hers. This is one of my greenhouses. I put glass only on the side I can look into. This is an older greenhouse. Notice the roof is fiberglass. So hell won't knock it out. This is Heather's. She put in a window greenhouse. Here's the outside. This is a breezeway greenhouse between the garage and the house. This is a lean-to greenhouse. But look, you can grow them at windows. Now this person happens to be putting some supplemental plant lights in it. A lot of times people are using lights. I've seen basements made in the greenhouse. I've seen spare bedrooms on the 50th floor, in Toronto. I'm going, you have a greenhouse on the 50th floor? Yeah, you want to see it? But it was just a spare room he had lined with plastic so it wouldn't ruin the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. And he grew everything under lights. Amazing what you can do under lights. And so you can see she's got dendrobium and phalaenopsis, and she's watching carefully so the inflorescence don't go up into the lights. I made that mistake a couple of times. And the lady slippers are down here. Outdoors, a nice shady area where you're going to get sunlight. When the orchids fade, you want to cut the flower stem off and let it start growing. Got to try this if you have room. This is a Darwin orchid. This is Angricum sesquispedale. Very fragrant. It's from Madagascar. Just amazing. You see this spur coming off the back of the flower right there? The nectar accumulates at the bottom of that flower. So Darwin hypothesized that there was a moth with a proboscis that long, 12 inches long. And boy, he was just laughed off the stage when he gave his presentation. And about 4 years after he passed, they found that moth. And so hybrids have been made with it. This is a beautiful one. Beautiful. This is the sesquispedale. The other one was crestwood, vanilla. And then in your landscape, you can put in what are called Batilla striata. These are Chinese ground orchids. So they're going to be sold as a ground orchid. Again, tubers under the ground. They'll freeze down in the winter and come out in the spring to bloom for you. So enjoy your orchids. Put them where you will enjoy them while they're in bloom, and then figure out where you can grow them according to the light requirements when you're finished. Lots of resources. The Fort Worth Orchid Society meets the first Monday of every month. Greater North Texas Orchid Society meets the first Sunday of every month at North Haven Garden Center. The Fort Worth Orchid Society meets at the Fort Worth Botanic Garden. And then the American Society has a list of all orchid collections all over the world that you can visit when you travel. So, if I can grow a phalaenopsis in my son's high school cowboy boots, he now has 2 kids. That's how long that's been going. We can do that. Here is my email address, and here's my phone number. I know I might have created more questions than I've answered, so don't hesitate to call me or email me and ask me, or I can visit with you later during the meeting. Thank you very much for inviting me. I sure appreciate it.